Picture this: turquoise water, sunlight bouncing off the Caribbean like it's showing off, and the camera drifting toward a green volcanic island that looks so peaceful you'd never guess it once made empires lose sleep. Welcome to Grenada, or, as its first people called it, Camerhone, a Kalinago name whose exact meaning is debated but carries the weight of a homeland long before maps pretended Europe owned everything. We're in the Lesser Antilles, just north of Trinidad, just south of St. Vincent, tucked into a chain of islands that colonial powers treated like chess pieces. Today they'll call it the Spice Island. Cute. Back in the 1600s, it was that island where resistance keeps ruining our plans. And since we're talking colonial discovery, let's get this out of the way. Christopher Columbus found Grenada in 1498 during his third voyage. You know, the classic explorer move. Arrive to an island already full of humans and declare it new. The Kalinago watched those sails come in like, here comes the problem. One historical anchor before we dive: the 1650 French settlement under Jacques du Parquet, which launched a century of conflict so intense that an anonymous 1657 French report simply wrote, "The island is beautiful, the situation is difficult." Translation: Grenada is stunning, and the Kalinago keep beating us. This island is gorgeous, but every ridge, every ravine, every quiet village has seen centuries of resistance. And up there, that mountain? Yeah. That ridge remembers everything. Long before a European ship drifted close enough to mispronounce it, Grenada was Camerhone, homeland of the Kalinago, the people colonial sources mistakenly called Island Caribs. Archaeology traces human presence here back at least 2,000 years, with continuous settlement through the Suazi and Trumassoid cultural phases that marked sophisticated pottery traditions and agricultural development. And let's be clear, these weren't wandering people waiting to be civilized. They had agricultural systems refined over centuries, canoe trade networks connecting dozens of islands across hundreds of miles of open water, political councils that mediated disputes and organized collective defense, and more social coherence than half the countries arguing on Twitter today. Fishing villages lined places like Guyave Bay and Sauteurs, where cassava bread roasted on clay griddles and warriors practiced archery on the beach at dusk, their arrows capable of piercing Spanish armor, as later colonizers would learn. Families cultivated taro, cassava, tobacco, cotton, and managed forested areas with practiced ecological knowledge passed down through generations of oral teaching. Their dugout canoes, some 50 feet long and capable of carrying dozens of people plus cargo, were basically the inter-island FedEx of the 1400s, moving goods, news, diplomatic messages, and people across hundreds of miles of open Caribbean water with navigational skills that impressed even hostile European observers. One early French ethnographic note from the 1650s observed with barely concealed surprise, "They live with great order among themselves," which is hilarious, given how Europeans later insisted they brought order to the region through colonization. The Kalinago had complex social structures, with chiefs called caciques, councils of elders, warrior societies, and spiritual leaders who maintained ceremonial knowledge. We don't have the names of every Kalinago leader in pre-contact Grenada. The archives only start caring when colonizers show up and need enemies to name. But we know their world was stable, mobile, and deeply spiritual. Drums echoed through villages at night. Tobacco rituals connected the living with ancestors. Lineage stories passed down through oral tradition maintained historical memory. Warrior training for young men combined physical skill with ethical instruction. All part of daily life in Camerhone. Women held significant economic power, controlling agricultural production and managing household economies. Children learned through apprenticeship, watching their elders farm, fish, navigate, and make decisions. Life here wasn't perfect. No society ever is. But it was theirs, functional, and it worked. Too bad someone else thought they needed it more. In August 1498, Christopher Columbus sailed past the northern coast of Grenada during his third voyage to what Europeans were calling the New World, though millions of people already lived there and had their own names for everything. He didn't land on Grenada, probably because the Kalinago waiting on shore looked like they had zero interest in welcoming him with open arms and fruit baskets. Ship logs simply note the island's existence and move on to more cooperative prospects elsewhere in the chain. But that first sighting set off a domino effect that would take 150 years to fully unfold. European maps now included a place they had never visited, never understood, but fully intended to own eventually. Throughout the early 1500s, the Spanish tried, diplomatically speaking, absolutely nothing on Grenada. The island wasn't a priority for settlement or conquest. Translation: the Kalinago resistance reputation made the risk too high for too little immediate profit, especially when gold-rich mainlands and larger islands offered easier pickings. Smart choice, honestly. Spanish colonizers were busy elsewhere, extracting gold and silver from continental mines, enslaving populations on larger islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, and establishing the plantation systems that would later spread everywhere. Still, colonial appetites grew with each passing decade. By the 1600s, as sugar plantations exploded across the region and transformed the Caribbean into the most profitable zone in the entire Atlantic world, Grenada's thick forests, freshwater rivers, and volcanic soil made it the next logical target. The Dutch, English, and French were all circling, looking for unclaimed territory. The storm was forming long before it made landfall, and when it finally arrived, it wasn't subtle. In March 1650, Jacques Duparquet, French governor of Martinique and ambitious colonial operator, arrived in Grenada with soldiers, settlers, priests, and a legal claim purchased from a French trader named Monsieur de Valmanière, who, to be absolutely clear, did not own Grenada and had no authority to sell it. Imagine someone selling you Buckingham Palace because they walked past it once and thought it looked nice. That's essentially what happened here. Duparquet paid 1,660 livres for an island that wasn't for sale. The French began building a settlement at what is now St. George's, constructing fortifications with thick stone walls, clearing land for plantations, and establishing the administrative infrastructure of colonial control. Relations with the Kalinago declined fast. Early reports note that Kalinago leaders protested the land theft directly, sending delegations to demand the French leave immediately. French sources describe them troubling the settlement, which is colonial shorthand for they wanted their own land back and weren't being quiet about it. After tensions escalated over months of French encroachment, clearing forests, claiming fishing grounds, building on sacred sites, fighting broke out across the island. The conflict was brutal and uneven, with French firearms, metal swords, and military organization against Kalinago arrows, clubs, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Kalinago fought with everything they had, using guerrilla tactics, ambushing French patrols, raiding supply lines, and making the colonizers pay for every inch of ground. The violence culminated in tragedy at what became known as Leaper's Hill in 1651, where a group of Kalinago, surrounded at the cliffs of Sauteurs and facing massacre or enslavement, reportedly leapt from the precipice rather than submit to French capture. French priest Jean-Baptiste du Tertre recorded it in his 1657 Histoire générale des Antilles with chilling brevity, noting that the Kalinago chose death over dishonor. Modern historians debate the exact details. Was it mass suicide? Were they pushed? Was it exaggerated in French accounts? But the place itself remains a memorial to indigenous resistance. But resistance didn't end there, despite what colonial histories often imply. Even under catastrophic odds, the first Grenadian rebellion was refusal itself. Refusal to accept invasion, refusal to submit, refusal to disappear quietly from history. Though reduced dramatically by disease, warfare, and forced displacement, Kalinago resistance continued for over a century after 1651. This is the part colonial histories love to skip, preferring neat narratives where indigenous people vanish after one dramatic confrontation. Reality was messier and more persistent. French plantation records from the 1650s through the 1760s frequently mention attacks on outlying settlements, forest ambushes of colonial patrols, and raids on provision fields that sustained the plantations. Translation: the Kalinago were still there, still defending their homeland, using guerrilla tactics that frustrated every attempt at total colonial control. A 1718 French military report noted with grudging respect, "They know every river, every tree. They vanish into the forest and return as ghosts." French soldiers, trained for European-style warfare, were completely unprepared for an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. The Kalinago would strike at dawn, disappear into mountains French troops couldn't navigate, and reappear miles away to strike again. This prolonged indigenous war against invasion counts as Grenada's ongoing first rebellion, a continuous thread of resistance that shaped the island's early colonial strategies and forced the French to maintain expensive military garrisons when they desperately wanted to focus on profitable sugar production. Every French soldier stationed in Grenada's interior was a soldier not available for expansion elsewhere. Every raid meant lost revenue. Every ambush meant fear. The French kept control of the island until 1762, when the British captured it during the 7 Years' War. That massive global conflict where European powers fought over colonial possessions on 3 continents. The Kalinago, by then reduced to small communities concentrated in the northern and eastern parts of the island, were often forcibly relocated to other islands like Dominica and St. Vincent, or absorbed into other indigenous communities across the region. Some intermarried with enslaved Africans, creating new communities of resistance. The first people of Camarhonge fought longer than the archives like to admit, and their resistance set a template that would inspire every rebellion that followed. When the French lost the island, the next empire inherited more than land. They inherited the problem of Grenadian resistance, the expectation that control would be contested, that profits would be interrupted, that peace would be temporary. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially handed Grenada to Britain, along with several other Caribbean islands that changed hands like properties in a colonial monopoly game where human lives were the currency. And just like every empire's favorite ritual, the British immediately conducted a comprehensive survey, wrote glowing descriptions about fertile lands ready for improvement, and got straight to plantation building with industrial efficiency. Sugar, coffee, cocoa, cotton, whatever could make them wealthy fast and justify the invasion. Governor George Scott wrote enthusiastically in 1764, "The island presents great opportunity for industrious planters." Translation: we're about to import thousands of enslaved Africans and pretend it's economic genius rather than systematic brutality. By the 1770s, Grenada's enslaved population had already surpassed the free population 10 to 1, with some parishes showing even more dramatic ratios of 20 or 30 to 1. The plantation machine was running at full speed, grinding human lives at every turn. Empire switched hands. Brutality stayed exactly the same. And enslaved Grenadians were already planning their next rebellion. A British sugar plantation in the 1760s through 1780s operated with military precision and zero empathy. Work began before sunrise at estates like Belvedere and Beausejour in St. Patrick's Parish, where gangs of enslaved workers moved through cane fields in organized rows under the watchful eyes of overseers on horseback. Cane-cutting gangs labored until exhaustion, cutting the thick stalks with machetes in tropical heat that reached over 90 degrees, their hands bleeding from the sharp leaves, their backs aching from bending thousands of times per day. Enslaved workers labored under overseers like John Hay, whose name appears in multiple estate records alongside documented abuse and complaints from enslaved workers who petitioned visiting officials when rare opportunities arose. Punishments were codified in plantation books with bureaucratic precision. Whipping for perceived laziness, shackling for attempted escape, isolation in punishment cells for insubordination, withholding of food rations for talking back. The 1776 Ledger of Belvedere Estate recorded matter-of-factly, 2 runaways recovered, punished accordingly. We know what accordingly meant. The scars carried testimony that bodies never forgot. Yet resistance began immediately and took forms both visible and invisible, both dramatic and mundane. Work slowdowns that reduced daily quotas just enough to frustrate overseers without triggering punishment. Tool breaking that seemed accidental but happened too frequently to be chance. A hoe handle that suddenly snapped. A cartwheel that mysteriously broke. Sabotaging cane mills by introducing stones into the grinding mechanisms, causing expensive damage that halted production. Night meetings in provision grounds to plan escapes, share information about sympathetic ship captains, and maintain cultural practices that slavery tried to erase. An enslaved woman named Daphne appears in an estate register for repeated absenting herself. Colonial code for using mobility as resistance, disappearing for days into the interior before returning. Maybe she was visiting family on another estate. Maybe she was meeting with Maroons. Maybe she was simply claiming time as her own. The records don't say, but her name appears again and again, proof that she refused to be completely controlled. Every single day on a plantation included rebellion, whether the archives dignified it with the word or not. But Grenada wasn't done with small acts of defiance. A far bigger explosion was brewing in the political tensions between old and new colonial masters. After the British takeover in 1763, French planters, now suddenly foreigners in a place they had dominated for over a century, rioted against new taxes, English-language legal requirements, and laws that marginalized their Catholic faith between 1765 and 1766. Grenada became a political battleground between old French elites who owned most of the productive land and new British rulers who wanted to reshape the island's governance in their own image. Colonial dispatches from 1765 complained nervously that French planters were assembling in turbulent numbers in St. George's and threatening British officials with violence if their demands weren't met. One official report to London accused them of disturbing the peace of His Majesty's new colony and plotting to restore French control through armed rebellion. French planters organized meetings, refused to pay new taxes, and in some cases physically confronted British tax collectors. This wasn't a rebellion of liberation. It was a rebellion of wealthy men angry about losing political power while desperately trying to keep their economic dominance intact. They didn't oppose slavery or colonialism. They just wanted to be the ones in charge. But it mattered tremendously because it weakened British authority at a crucial moment and created administrative chaos that would later provide space for the much larger uprising to come. British governors spent years trying to placate French elites, negotiate compromises, and establish legitimacy. This second rebellion showed that even the elites were rebelling against British rule. Grenada was warming up for something far more consequential, something that would unite the oppressed rather than the oppressors. With plantations dominating the fertile coastal areas throughout the 1760s through 1790s, many enslaved people fled to the interior hills near Trelawney Town and across the smaller island of Carriacou. These maroon communities weren't just hiding in caves and surviving on scraps. They were self-governing, militarized, culturally resilient societies that represented a genuine alternative to plantation slavery. They farmed cassava terraces on mountain slopes, hunted wild pigs and birds, traded secretly with sympathetic enslaved people still on plantations who would leave food and tools at predetermined locations, and communicated via drums and smoke signals that carried messages across miles of mountainous terrain. French and British military reports repeatedly complain with mounting frustration. They appear from nowhere, raid a provision field, and vanish back into the forest before troops can mobilize. The geography itself was a weapon. Grenada's mountains and thick forests allowed guerrilla tactics that completely frustrated British troops trained for European-style warfare on open battlefields. One 1780s British officer noted in his personal journal, "Our men march in circles while the hills laugh at us. The Maroons know paths invisible to our eyes, cross rivers we cannot find, and disappear into vegetation so thick we cannot follow." Maroon communities developed sophisticated early warning systems. Scouts watched coastal roads and signaled when troops were approaching. Families had evacuation plans and hidden camps deeper in the mountains. They built homes that could be quickly abandoned without losing essential supplies. Running away wasn't just survival. It was military strategy, economic resistance that denied plantations their labor, and the foundation of free communities where people could live according to their own values. Children born in maroon communities grew up free, learning agriculture, hunting, and warrior skills. They spoke languages that mixed African origins with new Caribbean Creoles. They practiced religions that combined ancestral beliefs with adaptations to new contexts. They were living proof that another world was possible, right there in the mountains overlooking the plantations. But the most famous rebellion was still to come, one that would combine maroon guerrilla tactics with revolutionary politics. In March 1795, Julien Fedon, a French Catholic free man of color who owned property in the parish of St. John, led free people of color and enslaved Grenadians against British rule in what became the third and fourth major uprisings that would merge into one massive revolutionary campaign lasting 15 months. Inspired by the French Revolution's promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and supported by French revolutionary agents operating throughout the Caribbean, Fedon declared allegiance to revolutionary France and launched a carefully planned campaign that had been brewing for months. Fedon's forces, numbering in the thousands at their peak with estimates ranging from 7,000 to 10,000 fighters, occupied St. George's for months, established a fortified camp in the mountains above Guyave that became known as Fedon's Camp, and coordinated brilliantly with maroon communities who had been waiting for exactly this moment. British Governor Ninian Home was captured during the initial uprising and held hostage, then later executed when British forces refused negotiation terms and launched an attack that killed several rebel leaders. British military archives detail terrified officers reporting back to London. The rebels move with incredible coordination. We are constantly outmaneuvered in terrain they know intimately. They strike at night, fade before dawn, and reappear elsewhere as if by magic. The rebellion combined mountain guerrilla tactics learned from generations of Maroons, sophisticated coordination between free people of color and enslaved insurgents who had different grievances but shared enemies, and strategic targeting of British estates and government installations that crippled the colonial economy. Fedon established a revolutionary government in the territories he controlled, complete with courts, supply systems, and diplomatic outreach to other French-controlled islands. He promised freedom to enslaved people who joined the rebellion, which thousands did. He organized military units with ranks and discipline. He collected intelligence through networks of sympathizers still living under British control. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. It was organized revolution. By June 1796, after 15 months of revolutionary war that saw British forces reinforced multiple times from Barbados and other islands, Fedon's forces were eventually defeated. The reasons were complex. Superior British firepower from cannon and naval vessels, naval reinforcements from neighboring islands that cut off supplies and reinforcements, internal betrayals by some free-colored elites who feared losing their property and status, and sheer exhaustion from fighting a larger military machine with limited resources. Thousands of rebels, including enslaved supporters from across the island who had risked everything for freedom, were killed in battle or executed afterward in public ceremonies designed to terrorize the population. Fedon's own fate remains debated by historians to this day. He likely fled to French-controlled territories like Trinidad or Guadeloupe, where he would be welcomed as a revolutionary hero, or died in hiding in Grenada's mountains, his body never found. Some oral traditions claim he lived into old age in Venezuela. Fedon's rebellion showcased remarkable intelligence, sophisticated political strategy, and the unbreakable will of Grenadians to resist oppression, even against overwhelming odds. But resistance didn't end with Fedon's disappearance from the historical record. The spirit he unleashed couldn't be captured or killed. After Fedon's military defeat in 1796, smaller revolts and persistent Maroon raids continued across the island through the 1820s, representing a fifth wave of sustained resistance that British authorities could never quite suppress. Estate records from Belvedere and Guyave note constant absenteeism that plantation managers couldn't control through punishment or incentives, sabotage of equipment, and crops that seemed random but followed clear patterns, and nighttime gatherings in remote provision grounds to plan escapes and maintain revolutionary networks that had survived Fedon's defeat. One British plantation ledger from 1803 complains bitterly, "No cane fields safe from nocturnal destruction, morale among overseers declining." Several have requested transfer to other islands where discipline is more effectively maintained. Enslaved Grenadians in Trelawney Town, across Carriacou, and on St. Patrick's estates maintained the spirit of organized resistance even without Fedon's charismatic leadership or revolutionary France's support. These decentralized actions kept British authority under constant strain and ensured that the plantation system never achieved the smooth efficiency that colonial administrators envisioned in their reports to London. Profit margins remained lower than other British Caribbean islands. Insurance rates stayed high. White settlers avoided Grenada, preferring islands with less troublesome reputations. The rebellion may have failed militarily, but it kept alive a culture of resistance that shaped daily life. Persistence matters more than victory. Grenada's hills were full of ghosts who refused submission and taught their children the same fierce independence. Every story told around night fires kept memory alive. Every song preserved revolutionary ideals. Every name given to a newborn child honored a fallen rebel. Culture became resistance when open rebellion became impossible. Britain abolished slavery throughout its colonies in 1834, responding to decades of abolitionist pressure in Parliament and mounting slave rebellions across the Caribbean that made slavery economically unsustainable and militarily expensive. But London introduced the apprenticeship system, a cruel halfway measure that meant former enslaved people were still forced to work on plantations for wages too low to survive on, essentially extending bondage under a different legal name, freedom in name only. This sixth rebellion manifested as organized work slowdowns that reduced plantation productivity below profitable levels, legal petitions sent to colonial authorities demanding true freedom and full wages, and small-scale riots recorded nervously in colonial office dispatches that worried about full-scale revolution. Grenadians in St. George's, Guyave, and Carriacou estates resisted the exploitation openly, refusing to accept apprenticeship as freedom and demanding immediate full emancipation. Governor Sir Lionel Smith's administrative records document mounting frustration among estate overseers, who could no longer enforce labor through direct violence and found their former authority crumbling. Former enslaved people simply walked away from abusive situations, demanded payment for overtime, refused dangerous work, and organized collective bargaining before that term officially existed. By 1838, after 4 years of sustained resistance and pressure from both local action and continued abolitionist advocacy in Britain, Grenadians forced the final end of apprenticeship ahead of its scheduled conclusion in 1840. Some estates were burnt or abandoned entirely as owners gave up and sold out to larger operations. Former enslaved communities began to form independent villages in the hills, spaces reminiscent of maroon settlements, where they could farm provision grounds communally, fish freely, and live with autonomy from plantation oversight. Legal abolition didn't erase oppression or magically create economic justice. Land ownership remained concentrated among white elites, wages stayed poverty level, and racial discrimination continued in every institution. But it shifted power back to the people, who now had a tiny space for autonomy and the legal right to refuse. Empire still wanted cheap labor, so new exploitative methods emerged almost immediately. Throughout the 1840s to 1870s, plantation owners imported indentured laborers from India, China, and Madeira to estates in St. David's, St. Patrick's, and across Carriacou, attempting to recreate plantation labor systems without chattel slavery. These indentured systems were exploitative and often brutal, but legally different from chattel slavery. Wages existed on paper. Contracts had theoretical endpoints usually around 5 years, but abuses were common and enforcement of labor contracts harsh. Workers who fled faced imprisonment. Those who complained faced deportation. Local Grenadians, both formerly enslaved Africans and new indentured workers who quickly recognized their shared exploitation, resisted by refusing work during peak harvest times when their labor had maximum value, sabotaging crops in ways that seemed natural rather than deliberate, and organizing clandestine meetings among peasant leaders who were building networks of solidarity across ethnic lines. African Grenadians taught Indian workers the island's geography and where to hide. Indian workers shared agricultural knowledge and organizing strategies from their homelands. The 1876 Confederation riots marked the 7th major uprising under colonial rule, as Grenadians violently protested new taxation schemes designed to extract more revenue, systematic land grabs by planters seeking to expand estates and deny peasants access to provision grounds, and administrative abuses by British officials who seemed determined to extract maximum wealth while providing minimal governance or social services. Violent demonstrations erupted across the island, with protesters burning government buildings in St. George's, confronting colonial police in street battles, and destroying tax records. The riots lasted for weeks and forced British authorities to back down on some of the most egregious taxation policies. Resistance evolved from maroon warfare to organized labor protest and political demonstration. The island never stopped pushing back against whoever tried to control it. By the 20th century, rebellion took an explicitly political turn towards self-governance. The final official rebellion in the 8-count came between 1951 and 1974, as Grenadians organized powerful labor unions under the leadership of Eric Gairy, a charismatic labor organizer who mobilized working-class Grenadians with fiery speeches and pragmatic organizing, leading strikes that paralyzed the island's economy by shutting down ports and plantations, and massive protests demanding fair wages, workers' rights, and political representation. Working-class Grenadians in St. George's, Guyave, and the countryside mounted sustained pressure against colonial administration. Gairy's labor movement, despite his later controversial authoritarian turn as prime minister after independence, initially represented genuine working-class aspirations for dignity, economic justice, and self-determination. His unions organized dock workers, agricultural laborers, domestic workers, and small farmers into a political force that couldn't be ignored. They demanded not just better wages, but political power, the right to vote, representation in government, and ultimately full independence from British colonial rule. This movement eventually paved the way for Grenada's independence on February 7, 1974, when the island finally gained full sovereignty after centuries of colonial control. This 8th rebellion demonstrates a remarkable continuity of resistance across centuries. Indigenous autonomy led to plantation rebellion, which evolved into maroon warfare, then labor activism, and finally political liberation through organized mass movements that combined all the lessons of previous generations. Resistance became institutionalized in labor unions and political parties, but the psychological imprint of centuries of struggle remains visible in Grenadian culture, music, storytelling, and the fierce independence that characterizes the island's identity today. From Kalinago arrows to maroon guerrilla tactics, to labor strikes to independence, every generation found new ways to say, "Not today, Empire, not ever." Picture the same mountain from the opening, wrapped in mist that rolls down from the peaks, overlooking a village where drums echo faintly from a festival celebrating heritage and survival. Children play cricket where battles once raged, their laughter carrying across valleys that once heard war cries and witnessed tragedy. From Camerhone to Grenada, the island's story is not about defeat or victimhood. It's about endurance, ingenuity, adaptation, and unbroken spirit across centuries of resistance against overwhelming power. Empires tried again and again with different strategies and increasing brutality to bend the island to their will. The island simply laughed back, leaving a blueprint for resistance and identity that stretches from Kalinago arrows to maroon guerrilla warfare, to labor strikes to independence. Every ridge still carries the memory of those who fought and died refusing submission. Every forest remembers the maroons who disappeared into green sanctuary and built free communities. Every drumbeat at contemporary festivals echoes rhythms that once signaled rebellion, coordinated attacks, and celebrated victories, both small and large. The 8 rebellions weren't separate incidents disconnected by time and circumstance. They were chapters in one continuous story of refusal to bow, refusal to accept domination, refusal to forget. The methods changed with circumstances, adapting to new forms of oppression. The spirit remained constant across generations, passed down through stories, songs, and the simple act of surviving with dignity intact. That mountain still stands, watching over an island that refused to be conquered, no matter how many empires tried. Every ridge, every forest, every drumbeat still remembers who refused to bow.